Good morning, and we are live. Welcome back to Sunday School with Murph. It is now officially September, and the fall equinox is coming up in a few weeks here, and I will have a new backdrop. It's how we know the seasons have changed, right? Because I changed my backdrop. I actually ordered a fall picture forest scene with yellow leaves in it. The other one I was using was nice, but it wasn't really fall. And so figured I'd get one that is actually fall. So just checking my microphone here. Alright, so gonna finish up on the life of Joseph, right? So still salvation typology. And so far, the last two lessons we've gotten into Joseph's life and how he is like, not just like Christ, so he's a type of Christ, but his whole entire life, everything, all the events that happened to him from a certain point is reflective of, it's a type of salvation for not just the Jews, but the Gentiles as well. And we're going to kind of get into that because when we finished last time, Joseph had been caught up and sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt. He spent some, he worked for Potiphar, who was the chief guard, very much like a high-ranking general kind of person. And Potiphar's wife was hitting on him and tempting him, and he resisted and ended up in jail because of it. And so after he had spent some time in jail, he was released because he was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and basically set the stage for Jacob and his family, of course Joseph's family, Jacob, his father, and his brothers, to come to Egypt to survive the drought and the famine. Because it had spread not just from Egypt, but it had spread out into the land of Canaan and the surrounding areas. So it's a very massive, massive drought. And because God had used Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, he was able to prepare. He was placed in charge of Egypt, basically. He was number 2 guy in the whole entire nation and was in the position to, for 7 years, to collect all the grain and then be prepared for the 7 years of famine that was going to come after that. So 2 years into that, roughly, a year to 2 years into that, is when the Israelites, is when Jacob and his sons are like running out of food. And we're going to pick up Genesis 42. So like I said, Joseph was born back in Genesis 30. I went back and did a little digging on this and went back and looked at that. And apparently Benjamin was born before Joseph was sold off into slavery. But he was still very, very young. And then in the process, their mother Rachel died during childbirth. So that was Jacob's favorite wife. That was the one he always wanted from the get-go. And she was only able to give him 2 sons and died during childbirth with the second son. So not only was Joseph the favorite son, once he thought he was dead, and that made Benjamin the favorite son because they came from his favorite wife. And that does play into what happens today. But, Genesis 37 picks up with Joseph getting his dreams. And he had, 2 separate dreams, or like one dream with 2 parts to it. And your sheaves will bow down to my sheaves, which that's a bundle of wheat or bundle of grain that's been harvested in the field before they can go around and pick it up with a wagon. And then, so that's the first dream, that the sheaves are bowing down to his sheaves, right? Which was symbolic of his brothers bowing down to him, but had something to do with grain and food and bread. And then the next dream, or the next part of that dream, was the stars, the sun and the moon, and the stars bowing down to him, which would imply, again, sun and moon, masculine, feminine, mother and father. So basically his whole family was going to bow down to him, right? So those dreams are there. God's setting the stage. And we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 42, verses 1 through 5. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So, again, Joseph's now in this position of authority. He has control over the food supply. He has control over the whole nation of Egypt, aside from whatever Pharaoh said to be done. But let's see here. So like I said, the brothers, Joseph's looking at his family going, "Hey," Jacob's looking at his family and saying, "Hey, go get us some food. They've got food over there." And he does not send Benjamin. Again, Benjamin is now the favored son. He's the youngest son. He's the last one. He's the only son left to him from Rachel, as far as he knows, because he doesn't know that Joseph is still alive. Matter of fact, the brothers don't know that Joseph is alive. So this is kind of a mystery to them. We see in verse 7, chapter 42, verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. So it's when you start reading through chapters 42 and 43, and you see the interaction between Joseph and his brothers and the way he treats them. And, you might say part of this is him getting a little bit of revenge, perhaps. Pardon me. And that's possible. I mean, he's human, like we are. He is a type of Christ, but he's human, we're human, and you have all those emotions coming back up from seeing his brothers, and that shows up as you read through these chapters. As he's trying to deal with them, he has to leave the room because he starts crying, right? All that emotion, all that stuff building up, and finally being able to be released, him to actually deal with his brothers for what they did to him. But when you actually take the whole thing in context, you take a step back and you look at it, he's essentially convicting them of wrongdoing. So conviction is coming upon Reuben and Judah and his brothers. And of course, Joseph is remembering these dreams that he had, that they were going to bow down to him. And here he is. He's got the food. They're trying to buy some food so they can live. And now they're subservient to him. And he starts giving them a bunch of grief that, like I said, convicts them to eventually confess to some degree. Let's see here. We saw 42 verse 9, Joseph remembered the dreams he had dreamed of them. And then he does something strange. Again, it's to convict them of what they had done. And Joseph accuses them of being spies. And he actually holds them in captivity, throws them in jail for 3 days, until they finally relent. And the key thing was, go back and get your little brother. Go back and get your youngest brother and bring him back here, and I'll know you're not spies, and everything will be okay. And in order to make them do that, he actually holds his brother Simeon, puts him back in jail until they return. And you got to imagine, this has got to be tough for these guys. They lost one brother And their father's like, not happy about that at all. And so he sends 10 brothers off to go get food, and 9 come back. It's like, wow. And Jacob actually says that later on. It's like, you went off and in search of food and you lost another brother. You were out in the field, you lost one brother. Now you went out looking for food, you lost another brother. What in the world are you guys doing? What kind of trouble are you getting into that you keep losing your brothers? And of course, Reuben promised Jacob that you can sacrifice my 2 sons if I don't bring your son Simeon back. But what's interesting is they waited. They didn't turn around and go right back. They used up the food that they had purchased. And actually, they didn't even purchase it because Joseph gave it to them for free because he put all their money back in their baskets with the food. And so they're really freaking out because they don't understand what's going on here. They didn't recognize Joseph in all his Egyptian garb and that sort of thing. So they have to go back to Egypt. They have to go before Jacob and say, hey, look, we're out of food. We got to go buy more food again. But if we go back, we can't go back without Benjamin. And of course, Jacob's like having a fit over this. And in order to get Simeon back, they've got to take Benjamin with them. And so finally, Jacob relents. So we really don't have an idea of the exact time frame, how long it took for them to travel from Egypt to Canaan, exactly where in Canaan they were. We're talking about several months, I would imagine. They traveled in large caravans for safety and to make sure they had enough stuff to carry their supplies with them to make it there and back. So I would, a few months for sure has passed. So Simeon's sitting in jail in Egypt, and they're all just kicking back, enjoying the food they bought until it runs out. And now they've got to go back now they've got to face the music. Now they've got to face Joseph again. And this is when he starts messing with them. So he sees his brother Benjamin. And again, this is his full brothers, not a half brother. The other 10 guys are half brothers. But this is his full brother Benjamin. And he sees him, gets emotional again. Really treats them well. They sit down, they have a feast. The Egyptians didn't like the Hebrews. They weren't at war or anything, but they felt that their ways were an abomination to them, so they couldn't eat with them. So anytime there were Hebrews around the Egyptians, they ate separately. And I think a lot of that had to do with not worshiping the false gods and some of the other stuff. But, so it was really interesting. And here's Joseph in the middle of this. And even he's not an Egyptian, so he couldn't eat with the Egyptians. And he wasn't going to eat with his brothers to fully reveal himself yet. But, it's kind of weird. They sat at different tables. Benjamin gets like 5 times the portions that everybody else gets. But then he does something interesting. And he slips a silver cup into Benjamin's bag with the food that they carried back when all that was said and done, and he accused him of stealing. Again, I believe this was all done in order to convict the brothers. And you see in Genesis 42, verses 21 through 23, then they said to one another, in truth we are guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy, but you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. Again, they don't know that this is their brother Joseph. He has an Egyptian name at this point. But they also don't know is Joseph still speaks Hebrew, so he understood every word they said, and there was an interpreter between them, as the scripture tells us. And so he's seeing that they're beginning to feel sorry for what they had done. They're beginning to realize, it's coming back to them. They have to deal with the sin that they have dealt with. Again, they're coming under conviction here. And, so again, they go back, they get Benjamin, they go back, and there's kind of this feast thing going on. And, it's a reuniting. So, I kind of got a little ahead of myself here. So in chapter 43, they go back to Egypt. Again, they wait until all the food runs out that they bought. They went back to Canaan. They come back to Egypt after they'd eaten all the food that they had gotten. And now this time Benjamin has to go with them. Of course, you get into Genesis 44, and Jacob is basically like, look, if y'all lose another son, I'm dead. I'm going to die of sorrow. And, so if Benjamin does not come back, and this is where Reuben promises that he can sacrifice his 2 sons if he doesn't bring Benjamin back, and Simeon. And so he's finally able to let go for Benjamin to go and get the food. He realizes that he has to do that because they're out of food again. I really think it was part of the brothers not really wanting to deal with and trying to figure out how they were going to deal with their father and with Egypt and trying to get things settled to get more food when they don't want to take Benjamin away from their father because they know how much pain that's going to cause. And so they're finally able, in Genesis 45, they sit down and they're having this meal, and Joseph can't handle it anymore, and he reveals himself to his brothers, and now they're freaking out. Now they're scared. And of course, it's fulfillment of the dreams that Joseph had something like 15 years before this. So Genesis 45, verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Verse 7, "And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and keep alive for you many survivors." So about this time frame, there's only about 70 people within Jacob's family. And, of course, we know that they're in Egypt for 400 years. And when they left Egypt, when you get into the Exodus, there's a million, 2 million Jews at this point. So in 400 years, if 70 people turns into millions of people, which is what God promised. When Jacob finally gets up and goes, and God tells him, says, "Hey, look, go ahead and go to Egypt. You're going to survive. I'll keep you alive. I'll build you into a great nation." So you begin to see the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham that I will make you the father of many nations. Your descendants will be as the grains of sand, and you won't be able to count them, kind of thing. And so here's Joseph dealing with this issue of going through, his brothers did something evil to him, and we think of this all. I know I think of this verse when I get into this stuff in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 through 21. "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear.'" Kind of get a little bit ahead of myself there, but we oftentimes quote this: God meant it, or you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And in the process of this, Reuben disqualified himself from being in the bloodline of Christ because of how he dealt with, I believe it was Dinah, his sister's rape. And since he was the ringleader in charge of going out and taking revenge, which they weren't supposed to do, he disqualifies himself. And then Judah actually disqualifies himself from being in the lineage of Christ by his involvement with his daughter-in-law Tamar. But in this situation here, Judah is the one who actually comes out and confesses to Joseph. Judah is the one who, he confesses the whole thing, tells the truth. He offers himself up to take the blame or the punishment for his brothers. And he really, his heart is corrected at that point, and that restores him to being in the bloodline of Christ. And eventually the family line of Judah is what leads to King David and eventually Christ. So the whole thing is representative of what God does for his people through a Savior, through a single man. And you have one man being sacrificed so that others may live. You have, through his sacrifice, salvation comes to the, and really he was there with his brothers, told his brothers about his dreams. They rejected him. That's what they did to Christ. When Christ came along and began to share the Word of God and actually properly interpret and teach the Torah to the Israelites and to the Sanhedrin, they rejected him and didn't like what they were hearing because it was the truth. And so, in that same fashion, Joseph is rejected by his family. Again, this is the nation of Israel. His 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. And, so Joseph is rejected. He is sacrificed, so to speak. Now, I said with typology, nothing is exact. It's similar to or very much like Jesus. So Jesus is sacrificed and his blood is spilled. Now they lie and tell their father that a wild animal had eaten Joseph, but in truth they left him in a pit to die of starvation and dehydration, in which he is then rescued by the Ishmaelite traders who sell him to Midianite traders, and he ends up in Egypt. So through Joseph's sacrifice, God puts him in Egypt in a place to provide salvation to the Jews eventually, to the Israelites eventually. But first, who gets saved first? The Gentiles do. The nation of Egypt and the surrounding nations that are able to come and buy food from him. And as you go through in the last several chapters in Genesis, you see where Joseph, it gets so bad with the famine that everybody basically sells all of their possessions to Egypt, and all that's left is the Israelites in the land of Goshen. And they don't sell everything, but everybody else has to sell everything. And so it's this full selling out to a Christ-like character who provides for them. And so the Gentiles prosper under the leadership of a Jew. And so, when Christ came, he brought salvation to the Jews first and then the Gentiles. The Jews rejected him. The Gentiles accepted him. Same thing here. The Egyptians accepted Joseph, and they were saved because of that. And then finally, the Israelites come along, and then they eventually accept their Messiah. So, like I said, this is just so blatantly obvious to me if you know of the gospel and you go back and you study your Old Testament, you read this and you're like, wow, that's very similar to what Christ did. And this shows up, that's why I say it's salvation typology. This shows up in multiple times in multiple places throughout the Old Testament. And this, in my opinion, is the most comprehensive typology that you have. And I mean, there's so many points of Joseph's life that you can line up with Christ, and make the connection. Because it's one of the things for me is I've always been, I don't know if amazed might be too strong of a word, but I've always been interested in how a Jew could just read the New Testament, read one of the Gospels, and be saved. And there are Messianic Jews out there that are like that. They're reading the New Testament and they're getting saved. They go back and they read Isaiah 53, and then they go and read the New Testament and they're saved. It's like, wow. How is it that being raised as a Jew under nothing but the Old Testament, and then you just read the New Testament and boom, you're saved? And you come to that saving knowledge, and a lot of that is recognizing the prophecy and recognizing that Christ is the fulfillment of these types of saviors, these types of messiahs in the Old Testament. Now, again, they're not exact. Joseph could not be exactly like Christ, because then he would have been the Messiah, and that would have really made things weird. David's the same way. He could not be exactly like Christ, because then he would be the Messiah. So this is not, like I said, it's not an exact science of figuring out typology. And you get into Hebrews and you get into some of this Paul's writings, and he does get into typology, and we'll look at Moses, and we'll look at David, and we'll look at Abraham, Noah. We'll get into these guys and their situations and show how that it's so similar to Christ and what Christ went through. But again, it's, saving a remnant. Every time things get bad enough, God preserves a remnant to carry on the bloodline through the Israelites to the Messiah. And so, there's always going to be some remnant of God's creation that he will preserve no matter how bad things get. And that leads us to salvation. If we want to be part of that remnant, if we want to be part of the ones who survive and that continue on with God, we've got to give ourselves to God, and we have to accept his provisions for our salvation, because we can't get there by ourselves. I mean, that was the whole Tower of Babel thing, and false religion ever since is man trying to get back to heaven without going through God. And that's, heaven is where eternity is. Heaven is where life is. The tree of life, go and read Revelation. The tree of life that was taken out of the garden is in heaven. And, it's just this amazing story. It's so, you have 66 books of the Bible, 40-something different authors, written over about a 4,000-year period, and it all works together. It all points towards Christ, and there's no way to avoid that. If you were to actually honestly sit down and read this thoughtfully, there's no other conclusion. There's no way to claim that Christ was some kind of false god, or that there's more than one fake God, fake Christ out there that were born of. Nobody else was born of a virgin. So as I wrap this up, keep in mind that it is God's plan for us to know this stuff and to go out and make disciples and teach other people this stuff. So God bless. I will see you next time, and stay cool.